Hello everyone, this is Venom Geek Media here. Before we get started, I'd like to give a thanks to my members, James C., Jeff Hallam, Commander Rock Cross Discovery, Heretical Cabbage, Marcus Hall, and Jean-Luc Martel. Thank you guys so much for supporting my channel. If any of you guys want to support my channel further, you can do so by becoming a member. Thank you so very much. Right, so today I want to do a discussion video on warp speed combat because there's a lot of misunderstanding and inconsistency about the place. And okay, there are certain things that I'm going to say that are that aren't contradicted by canon, because there absolutely are. I know it. I'm just going to say that the canon itself is inconsistent. So just because you can dig up something that contradicts what I say, and I'm sure you can, in fact, I know you guys will, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're right. It just means that in canon it's treated inconsistently, and frankly, if we want the universe to be consistent, we have to rectify and balance all of these. So when it comes to warp speed combat, one of the things I hear a lot is when people bring up the Battle of Deep Space Nine or Operation Return, and everyone's like, well, why don't they just go around the Kardashian Dominion fleet? And it's like, okay, yes, you could, but you just get intercepted. There's a certain distance at which, and this is the same in real life, is like at which a force, you're basically engaged, and it doesn't matter how much you shift, the enemy is going to shift with you, and you are going to engage. It's just a case of where. So, I mean, that really brings us to the main point, because unlike in Star Wars, and this is one of the reasons I prefer Star Trek to Star Wars, in Star Wars, you jump to hyperspace, you get away scot-free. Doesn't matter. If in the Star Wars universe they had warp drive, the Empire would have won easily. You can't just outrun something at warp speed, and just because you're warp doesn't mean you can't get shot. So it's like you could try to run a blockade at warp, and particularly if you've got high performance ships, maybe you would try your luck at that. But if you don't, you're going to get knocked out of warp, and you're going to be at a disadvantage. So one of the things of warp speed combat is it can often be the preliminary stage of an engagement. And basically, if you get knocked out of warp, if you're the one to be knocked out of warp, you're at a bit of a disadvantage, because oddly enough, starships don't like being thrown out of warp suddenly. They don't really enjoy that. That can't be healthy. It also means that the enemy can then choose where to engage. And that's the other aspect of warp speed combat, is you're kind of seeing who will then have the initiative or advantage in the sublight fight. But you're also seeing, you're also trying to make that sublight fight happen somewhere where you want it to be. So, I mean, that's why that can happen. The other thing is warp speed combat and formation doesn't go well together. So, okay, your ship, the command ship, your flagship, might be very fast and might have high warp performance, and they might not be able to knock it out. But if they can knock out all your escorts, well, you're going to get to wherever you're going with just yourself, and you're not going to be much use when you get there. So that's the other aspect, is like, okay, if you want to keep cohesion, the sensible thing is to not partake in warp speed combat. If you're relying on the cohesion of your force, then going into a warp speed battle probably isn't the most sensible idea. So that's why in Deep Space Nine, in Operation Return, they drop out of warp in front of the blockade. Because if they do, they'll all just get picked off one by one, and they'll be scattered across half the sector. And then they'll never get anywhere, and they'll be picked off easily by marauding patrols. So that's why warp speed combat is important. So not only just tactically and getting the upper hand in a subsequent engagement, but in terms of maneuver. So that then brings us to an inconsistency, and it's a known inconsistency, and that is, can you use phasers at warp? Logically, according to the logic of the universe, no, there's no way. I know it happens in shows. I can recall scenes in Enterprise, probably Voyager, where it happens. that doesn't mean it's acceptable or that it's correct or fits in the universe. It doesn't. Right. A phaser beam is just it's a particle beam. It's an energy beam. Right. That's all it is. It's channeled energy and then directed at a target. What speed does it travel at? Well, okay, if we're being generous, we'd say the speed of light. Now, people have actually said, well, actually, it probably doesn't travel at the speed of light, which I would accept. But in any case, warp speed is going to be faster, even if it's not the speed of light. What's going to happen is the moment because remember, the warp field is basically a spatial distortion. It's a gravimetric distortion. And once an object or matter leaves that field, well, what's going to happen? It's going to be subjected to the normal forces of physics. So while inside that warp field, that phaser beam is travelling at warp speed, or a relative warp speed to the ship, the moment it leaves that field, it's going to go right back down to its real space speed, which is speed of light or less, i.e. slower than warp drive. So what's going to happen is you're almost going to get a kind of, it might look pretty, you probably get like a rainbow effect as the beam is stretched out behind the ship and it's sort of dispersed across different wavelengths. So it might be pretty, won't be very useful. And that is why phasers shouldn't be used at warp. Okay, so let's talk then about photon torpedoes. I've briefly talked about them, but the reason that they can be fired at warp is basically they have sustainer engines. It's utter nonsense, but whatever. Essentially, you have to say that it absorbs some of the energy of the warp field to generate its own mini warp field, or it's generated maybe in the torpedo tube. Now, we've never seen torpedoes launched from impulse into warp speeds, but I think you definitely could do that. I think that'd be a very interesting idea as a way of knocking ships out that are travelling at high warp, and you just kind of snipe them from impulse power. But yeah, photon torpedoes are the primary, well, they're your only weapon at warp speed. That's why they're so important. And in fairness, it's not just photon torpedoes, it's any kind of torpedo-like thing. So it's just any kind of solid projectile missile weapon, provided it has that sustainer engine thing. But so you could build that into, say, a nuclear missile or a nuclear torpedo or any other kind of charged, explosive device. The warhead you stick on the end is really by the by. It's just whatever's effective. So yeah, photon torpedoes are your primary means of fighting at warp. That's why having torpedoes is really quite important. As one of the reasons, some people say that the Kardashians don't have torpedoes because there's no on-screen evidence. I think the assumption is they just do, and the effects guys just never felt like doing them. And also, if you didn't have torpedoes, you'd be or some kind of missile or projectile, you'd be absolutely useless because you couldn't defend yourself at warp. So really moving on from torpedoes, other than they are an absolute necessity, that then really brings us to another thing that I've seen, not as many, but some people take issue with and argue about, and that's warp speed maneuvering, or more precisely, turning at warp. Again, I know that there's a line in Voyager in which Tom Paris says that in order to turn, drop out of warp, go to impulse, come to your new heading, and then go back into warp. No, that would be stupid, and not very efficient. And that's also that doesn't seem to be what was conceived of when they built the original Enterprise and so on and so forth. One of the, definitely in the Enterprise, USS Enterprise owner's manual, and I appreciate these are, beta canon sources. They're just a bit of fun, but it's by Mike Okuda, and it says, well, that's why you have two engines, is because left-right steering basically. Now, of course, there's more to space than left and right, as people constantly tell me in the comments, and there is, of course, up and down. So actually, would 2 be enough? Realistically, well, maybe not. That's the whole thing. In any case, That's why you have two nacelles, is that it allows more steering. Okay, what about a single nacelle ship? Well, wouldn't steer in the same way. So I mean, with a two nacelle ship, I could imagine that your basic steering, pitching and inclining like an aircraft, or almost like tank steering left and right, just on a flat plane. I would imagine that whole left-right thing isn't going to really be an easy thing for a single nacelle ship. I don't think it could do that very well, or at all. I think it would have to, because it can still kind of turn itself inside its own warp field, and that's changed the direction a bit. It would have to sort of lean either side in its warp field, sort of pitch or roll. Yes, like roll within the warp field, and that would steer it. And so it's probably not as responsive as, say, a two-engine ship. And then there's the whole thing of three-engine ships. I've talked about that previously, and that basically what that would do is give an unstable element that you would allow for more pitching and just maneuvering at unusual angles, and more responsive maneuvering because you're kind of off balance. And then four-engine, again, I've covered, where I've said it's just very stable. It's a very strong and stable warp field. It's not the most steerable, but it is quite fast, and it's very stable. And that's another thing that, of course, dictates warp speed combat is, okay, how many engines do you have? Because the amount of engines you have, tells us, how stable the warp field is. The more stable the warp field, the more you're going to have to hit it before they drop out of warp. Because just knocking out, with a two-engine ship, you can knock out one engine and they will probably drop out of warp. Whereas a four-engine, you're probably going to have to take at least 3 of them out before it goes to impulse. The next thing I'm going to discuss is positioning of nacelles. So, and this gets very complicated once you start mixing in 3 and 4 nacelles on top of just basic nacelle positioning. But there does seem to be basic sets of positions. One of the things that Starfleet ships seem to do is they all have, all the Enterprises have their nacelles either at the center line or above of the ship. So either between, sort of in the line between the saucer and the secondary hull. So for that you would see the Ambassador and the Galaxy. Or just above, so the saucer section. So that would be the Constitution or the Sovereign. They do that to kind of ride the forward lobe of the warp field. You're also kind of setting the warp field at a very high angle and sort of sitting in it like, I guess, like a pocket would be my guess, and sort of leaning forward into it, which is what would give them the greatest speed. What I would say is that would probably lend them less maneuverability because the source of the field is, compared to other things, obviously then there's the subset of maneuverability with the engines you're using. But if you look at then Klingon ships, one of the generally held things is that while Klingon ships aren't necessarily as fast at warp, they probably have better acceleration because they're really leaning forward, and they probably have greater maneuverability because, and this is something that again particularly makes sense with something like the Miranda, the warp field is being generated below the ship's mass. And I know it's all relativistic, it doesn't actually matter, because space is 4D and there's no up or down. The Klingon ship is effectively sitting on top of that warp field, so it's more, again, it's going to be more responsive to movements. There's going to be more angle of action on it. Romulan ships are almost, there's a lot of variation, but if you look at the Birds of Prey and actually then the Diduridex, both of them, well, the Birds of Prey do have it above, but it's much lower than compared to others, so that actually creates a very sleek profile. And then with the Diduridex, I think it's generally held that the reason it has that double hull, one of the reasons for that double hull, is that it helps conceal the warp field. It can create a powerful enough warp field to fly that big ship, but it's contained it's easily contained within the cloaking profile as well. So there's no discrepancy. The only other kind of ships that, well, I mean, there's two others that I'll talk about briefly. The Kardashians, where their nacelles are, generally it's held that the nacelles are actually in those forward set of wings. Those pincers, as far as I'm concerned, at the back, I think they're like symmetrical warp governors, like you see on the NX-01, or something like that, some kind of additional paraphernalia. Bear in mind where the Kardashians are technologically. Now, their warp nacelles are slap bang in the centre of mass. And I know they can't see each other, but that rule got thrown out. It makes sense that they would produce more stable, and that probably produces very stable warp fields for them. And particularly if you look at earlier Kardashian ships, that does make a lot of sense with their design philosophy. They do like their sturdiness. The only other ship I'm going to bring up is Vulcan ships, with their annular warp drive. And it's a shame that we haven't seen anything like that since, because it's really quite cool. And basically, again, similar to the Doduridex, although kind of on the opposite end of the scale almost, where they put the Romulans try to put the warp field inside the ship's mass. Well, the Vulcans try to fit the ship's mass as much as they can inside the warp field, and basically you get the impression that warp field is almost like a tube or like a cone, and that is what produces the high speed. That's what makes the Vulcan ships of their day so incredible, is that they have this very advanced annular design. There's probably a lot of problems to it. Well, it's going to be it's effectively a single nacelle, and it requires a lot of resources putting into it. If you're going to design an annular ship, you can't go half measured, and I don't think there's as much. In fact, there's probably barely any in the way of maneuverability or responsiveness or good acceleration, which is probably why annular warp drive dropped out. It's a very impressive mode of propulsion and is very stable and probably quite fast for its day, but it's not something that can be easily built upon. That's why twin nacelle warp designs become the mainstay. So I mean, I think that's all I've got to say on warp speed combat. These are just my ideas. The whole thing I'm trying to look for here, I know that there's probably canon that contradicts these things, but what I'm looking for is internal consistency. Okay, yes, there are some things where on one occasion Voyager did something wrong. No surprises there. But that does not mean that what is indicated by the rest of canon is then just invalidated. You just have to take that as a gaffe, as a continuity gaffe. And that's one of the irritating things about lore crafting with Star Trek. But, you make do. So thank you guys for watching. And I will see you guys in the next video.